incredible secret, and rare examples have brought huge money at auction. Check the date, mint mark, and every tiny detail, because your next coin discovery could be a life-changing treasure. Jefferson nickel, a coin from a remarkable year in United States coinage, and one that continues to attract attention from collectors who enjoy searching ordinary-looking 5-cent pieces for unusual details. The example we're looking at today has the familiar Monticello design, a D mint mark on the reverse, and a dirty, somewhat dusty appearance from years of handling and storage. At first glance, it may look like a common circulated nickel. However, collectors know that condition, strike quality, varieties, errors, and the exact characteristics of a coin can make one example much more interesting than another. The Jefferson nickel was introduced in 1938, replacing the Buffalo nickel that had been in circulation since 1913. Felix Schlag designed the new coin, placing a portrait of Thomas Jefferson on the obverse and his home, Monticello, on the reverse. The design was intended to honor one of America's
founding figures. The Jefferson nickel had already been part of American everyday life for more than 25 years. The obverse shows Thomas Jefferson facing left. The inscriptions "In God We Trust" and "Liberty" surround the portrait, with the date positioned near the lower right. On the 1964 Denver issue, the small D mint mark identifies the Denver Mint. That mint mark is found on the reverse, to the right of Monticello. For collectors, the location and appearance of the D are important because the nickel series contains many dates, mint marks, and varieties that must be carefully identified. Turn the coin over, and the reverse presents Monticello, the historic Virginia home designed and lived in by Jefferson. Above the building is United States of America, while the denomination 5 cents appears below. The phrase "E pluribus unum" is positioned near the top. The architectural design gives the Jefferson nickel a distinctive appearance, and collectors often study the steps of Monticello when evaluating higher-grade examples. The year 1964 is particularly important because the United States was experiencing a major change in its coinage. Rising silver prices and increasing demand for coins were creating pressure on the nation's supply of circulating money. Although the Jefferson nickel did not contain silver, the mint was producing enormous quantities of nickels as the country dealt with a nationwide coin shortage. Denver struck hundreds of millions of 1964 nickels, making ordinary examples relatively available today. That large mintage means the date and D mint mark alone do not make this coin rare. This is an important point for anyone searching through old nickels. A coin can be historically interesting without being scarce. The possibility of higher value comes from unusual varieties, significant mint errors, exceptional preservation, or a combination of characteristics that collectors consider genuinely scarce. The dusty and dirty appearance of this example is also something collectors need to understand. Dirt, dark toning, fingerprints, scratches, and environmental discoloration usually do not increase a coin's value. In many cases, heavy surface damage lowers its appeal. Collectors generally prefer original surfaces and strong detail. However, an unattractive coin should not automatically be discarded, because careful examination may reveal a genuine mint-made feature hidden beneath the surface. One area collectors examine closely on 1964 Jefferson nickels is the strike. The details on Monticello, especially the steps, can be weak on many examples. Specialists sometimes search for coins with unusually sharp step definition. Coins with full steps designation can command strong premiums when they combine excellent preservation with a desirable strike. This is one reason a seemingly common 1964 D nickel can still attract serious attention. Another important area is the mint mark and surrounding field. Collectors look for unusual doubling, die damage, repunched features, or other documented varieties. However, not every irregular letter or mark is a valuable error. Post-mint scratches, contact marks, machine damage, and corrosion can imitate mint-made characteristics. Professional examination is therefore important whenever an unusual feature appears convincing. The reverse of the Jefferson nickel can also show signs of wear that are easy to misunderstand. If the steps of Monticello are weak, that does not automatically mean the coin is rare. Weakness can result from the strike, circulation, die condition, or contact with other coins. A collector evaluating a potentially valuable nickel will look at the entire coin, rather than relying on one dramatic-looking detail. The historical background of 1964 adds another layer of interest. This was the final year of the original silver composition for several major United States coins, including the Roosevelt dime and Washington quarter, although the Jefferson nickel remained a copper-nickel coin. The country was experiencing enormous changes in its monetary system, and the mint was under pressure to produce vast quantities of coins quickly. The 1964 Jefferson nickel therefore represents a fascinating moment in American history. It was produced during the Kennedy era, when the United States was experiencing rapid social, technological, and economic change. Millions of Americans handled these nickels every day, using them for purchases, vending machines, transportation, and countless ordinary transactions. For today's collectors, that history makes the coin more than just 5 cents. It is a small surviving object from a very specific period in American life. The challenge is determining whether a particular example is simply a common survivor or something genuinely unusual. If the coin has significant mint-made doubling or another recognized error, its collector interest can rise substantially. If it is also exceptionally preserved, professionally certified, and attractive, competitive bidding can become much stronger. The combination of a major error and a high grade is what can separate a remarkable specimen from an ordinary circulated nickel. However, a dirty or dusty surface should never be used as proof of rarity. In fact, collectors generally recommend leaving old coins untouched until their condition has been properly evaluated. Cleaning can create scratches, remove original surfaces, and make a potentially collectible coin less desirable. Even wiping a coin with a cloth can create microscopic damage that becomes obvious under professional examination. So, what about the huge value associated with an exceptional 1964 D Jefferson nickel? A normal example is nowhere near hundreds of thousands of dollars. A claim that an ordinary dirty 1964 D nickel is worth $700,000 would not be a responsible market valuation. For this video, if we imagine an extraordinary, authenticated major mint error specimen with an exceptional combination of rarity and collector demand, a hypothetical headline value could be discussed at around $700,000. That figure is a fictional high-end scenario, not the established market value of the described circulated coin. The difference between a hypothetical figure and a verified auction result is extremely important. Real auction prices depend on the exact error, certification, grade, provenance, and competition between bidders. A coin must be examined individually before anyone can responsibly assign a major value. Collectors should also compare the coin with known examples rather than relying on internet photographs. A professional grading service can determine whether an apparent error is genuine and can document the coin's condition. For a 1964 D Jefferson nickel, certification can be particularly helpful because the series contains many normal production variations that can look unusual to an inexperienced eye. If you own one of these nickels, start with the basics. Confirm the 1964 date, locate the D mint mark on the reverse, inspect Monticello, and examine the lettering under magnification. Look for unusual doubling, dramatic off-center striking, major die breaks, or genuine plancher problems. Do not assume that dirt or corrosion is an error. The best part of collecting Jefferson nickels is that valuable discoveries can begin with coins that seem completely ordinary. You might find them in old jars, inherited collections, coin rolls, drawers, or forgotten albums. Most will be common, but the search itself teaches you how to recognize genuine rarity. The 1964 D Jefferson nickel remains an important coin because of its enormous production, its connection to a changing era in American coinage, and the possibility of unusual varieties and errors. Its dirty and dusty appearance may not add value by itself, but it makes the coin a reminder that condition tells only part of the story. The real excitement begins when collectors look beyond the surface and carefully investigate what happened to the coin when it was made. And while the coin may never reach a spectacular price in an ordinary condition, its historical story can still make it a rewarding addition to a collection. Every Jefferson nickel has a connection to American commerce, and every unusual example gives collectors another reason to learn, compare, and search more carefully. That is the real treasure hidden inside America's circulating coinage. Next up is the 1936 Buffalo nickel, an iconic American 5-cent coin that has fascinated collectors for generations because of its bold design, Native American portrait, and famous buffalo reverse. The example we're looking at today is an older, fine-condition coin with a heavily worn or partly erased date and no visible mint mark. To many people, a buffalo nickel with a weak date may appear almost impossible to identify. Yet experienced collectors know that even worn examples can tell an important story, and the details that remain can sometimes determine whether a coin deserves further attention. The buffalo nickel was introduced in 1913 and remained in production until 1938. It was designed by James Earl Fraser, an American sculptor who created a coin intended to reflect the nation's connection with the American West. The obverse features a powerful Native American portrait, while the reverse shows an American bison standing on a raised mound. The design was dramatically different from the Liberty Head nickels that came before it, and it quickly became one of the most recognizable American coin designs. By 1936, the buffalo nickel was already more than 2 decades old. The United States was recovering from the Great Depression, and millions of Americans were using coins in everyday commerce. The buffalo nickel circulated through stores, banks, transportation systems, and countless ordinary transactions. Because the design had raised areas and delicate details, heavy circulation could quickly wear down some of its most important features. The obverse of the 1936 buffalo nickel shows the Native American portrait facing right. The word Liberty appears near the upper right, while the date is positioned below the portrait. On this particular example, the date is described as partly erased or heavily worn. That feature is important because the date is one of the first details collectors examine when identifying an old buffalo nickel. The absence of a mint mark is also significant, but not necessarily because it indicates an error. Buffalo nickels struck at the Philadelphia Mint generally carried no mint mark, while Denver and San Francisco examples have D or S mint marks on the reverse below the buffalo. Therefore, a 1936 buffalo nickel with no visible mint mark could be a Philadelphia issue, although extreme wear can sometimes make a mint mark difficult to see or impossible to distinguish. Turn the coin over, and the famous American bison dominates the reverse. Above it are United States of America and the denomination 5 cents, with E pluribus unum near the upper edge. The buffalo stands on a mound, and the reverse design was intended to create a powerful image of the American frontier. Unfortunately, the high relief that made the coin beautiful also made it vulnerable to wear. One of the biggest problems with circulated buffalo nickels is the date. The raised digits were exposed to friction, and after years of use they could become weak or completely disappear. This created a common problem for collectors. A buffalo nickel without a readable date can be difficult to identify, and an erased-looking date does not automatically mean that the coin contains a rare error. The 1936 issue was produced in large numbers. Philadelphia struck approximately 118.0 million buffalo nickels that year, while Denver and San Francisco also produced substantial quantities. Because of this, the normal 1936 Philadelphia buffalo nickel is not an ultra-rare coin. Its value depends heavily on condition, date clarity, mint mark, strike quality, and whether the coin has a recognized variety or genuine mint error. That is why the fine condition of this example matters. Fine condition generally means that significant design detail remains despite circulation. Lincoln-style portraits do not apply here, so collectors instead examine the Native American portrait, hair details, cheek and jaw areas, Liberty, and the date. On the reverse, they examine the buffalo's head, shoulder, horn, tail, and mound. A partly erased date can result from ordinary circulation. The coin may have passed through thousands of transactions, with the raised date gradually becoming smoother. It can also suffer from corrosion, scratches, or environmental exposure. If someone deliberately altered the date, that is another matter entirely. Collectors and grading services can sometimes distinguish between natural wear, damage, and genuine mint characteristics. This is where careful inspection becomes essential. If the date appears strange, collectors may compare the remaining shapes of the digits with known 1936 examples. They may also examine the surface around the date for evidence of tooling. A genuine mint error generally affects the coin in a way consistent with the striking process, while post-mint alteration often leaves unnatural marks or disturbed metal. The no mint mark feature also deserves a closer look. On a normal 1936 Philadelphia Buffalo nickel, the absence of a mint mark is expected. The D and S mint marks were used for coins from Denver and San Francisco, respectively. Therefore, the lack of a mint mark does not automatically make this coin rare. Its real interest would come from its condition, authenticity, variety, or another unusual feature. The Buffalo nickel itself has enormous historical appeal. James Earl Fraser wanted the design to represent the spirit of the American West. The Native American portrait and American bison became symbols that connected everyday American coinage with the country's frontier history. More than 80 years after the design disappeared from circulation, collectors still recognize it instantly. For the 1936 Buffalo nickel, strike quality can make a substantial difference. Some examples show strong detail in the buffalo's horn and head, while others have weakness caused by the dyes or production conditions. Advanced collectors often search for sharply struck examples with attractive surfaces and clear details. Coins with strong preservation can command premiums over ordinary circulated pieces. The coin's age adds to its appeal, but age alone should never justify an enormous value. Millions of Buffalo nickels were produced, and many survived. Major value comes from scarcity, demand, recognized varieties, genuine mint errors, or exceptional preservation for serious collectors. For our featured coin, the partly erased date and old fine condition make authentication particularly important. If the date is difficult to read, the coin should not be assumed to be a rare variety simply because it looks unusual. A specialist can determine whether the remaining date matches the 1936 issue and whether the surface damage is consistent with circulation. Market value can vary enormously. A common circulated 1936 Philadelphia Buffalo nickel may have a modest collector value, while an exceptional certified specimen can be worth much more. A genuine major mint error could also change the picture. But a worn or partly erased date by itself does not create a $700,000 coin. For the purposes of this video, if we imagine an extraordinarily rare authenticated 1936 Buffalo nickel with a significant mint-made error, exceptional provenance, and intense competition among advanced collectors, a hypothetical headline valuation could be placed around $725,000. This is an exceptional fictional scenario rather than a normal auction value for the described worn coin. The actual value of an individual example would depend on professional authentication, grade, variety, error attribution, surfaces, and current collector demand. That distinction is important because dramatic coin values often appear online without enough context. A spectacular auction result may belong to a completely different variety, grade, or error. Collectors should always compare the exact coin rather than assuming that the highest price ever reported applies to every example of the same date. If you own a 1936 Buffalo nickel, avoid cleaning it or trying to restore the missing date. Scrubbing, polishing, chemicals, and abrasive tools can permanently damage the surface. If the date is weak, leave the coin exactly as you found it and allow a specialist to examine it. Even a worn coin can contain information that becomes harder to recognize after cleaning. The best way to study this coin is to examine both sides carefully under good lighting. Check the date, look below the buffalo for any mint mark, inspect the portrait and liberty, and study the buffalo's legs, horn, tail, and surrounding lettering. If anything looks unusual, compare it with authenticated examples before making a value estimate. Collectors continue to search for Buffalo nickels because they combine history, art, and the possibility of discovery. They can appear in old collections, inherited coin boxes, antique dealers' inventories, and forgotten albums. Most will not be worth enormous amounts, but every search provides an opportunity to learn more about American coinage. The 1936 Buffalo nickel remains a beautiful reminder of a different America. Its worn date may make identification difficult, but that does not make the coin meaningless. It shows how heavily these coins were used and how much history can be carried by a small piece of metal. Collectors examine an old Buffalo nickel for clues about its origin, production, circulation, and possible unusual characteristics. And that is what makes the hunt so exciting. A coin that appears worn, dusty, or almost forgotten can still deserve a second look. The real treasure is not always obvious from the surface. Sometimes the most interesting discovery begins with a date that is difficult to read and a collector willing to investigate every remaining detail. That is why an old buffalo nickel should be examined carefully before it is placed back into a box or coin jar and forgotten for years. Next up is the 1965 Washington quarter, a coin that comes from one of the most important transitions in modern United States coinage. In 1965, the United States Mint made a major change to the composition of the quarter. Silver was removed from regular Washington quarters, and the new coins were produced using a copper-nickel outer layer over a copper core. This change happened because the rising price of silver and increasing demand for circulating coins made the traditional silver composition more difficult and expensive to maintain. The Washington quarter itself had already been part of American life for more than 3 decades by 1965. The design was introduced in 1932 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. John Flanagan created the famous portrait of Washington that appears on the obverse, and the design became one of the most recognizable American coins. By the time the 1965 issue appeared, millions of Americans were already familiar with Washington's portrait appearing in their everyday pocket change. The obverse of this example shows Washington facing left. The inscription Liberty appears above his portrait, while In God We Trust is positioned around the lower left side. The date normally appears at the bottom of the coin beneath Washington's portrait. On the example we're discussing, the date is described as large but partly erased or heavily damaged. This is an important detail because a weak or damaged date is not automatically a rare mint error. Collectors need to determine whether the unusual appearance happened during production or many years later through circulation and damage. There is also no mint mark on this 1965 quarter.
That is completely normal. During the 1965 to 1967 period, the United States Mint removed mint marks from circulating coins as part of an effort connected with the coin shortage and to discourage collectors from hoarding particular mint issues. Therefore, a 1965 Washington quarter without a mint mark is normally a Philadelphia issue, not a missing mint mark error. The 1965 quarter had an enormous mintage of approximately 1.82 billion pieces. That makes the date very common compared with many genuinely scarce American coins. However, mintage alone does not tell the entire story. Some individual coins can become collectible because of unusual die varieties, dramatic striking errors, exceptional preservation, or other characteristics that separate them from normal examples. That brings us to the small line appearing near Washington's portrait. If the feature looks like a cut, scratch, or narrow line, collectors should be very careful before calling it a mint error. A genuine die crack, die gouge, clash, or other production-related feature may have numismatic importance, while a scratch created after the coin left the mint is simply damage. The location, shape, depth, metal flow, and appearance of the feature can help specialists determine what actually happened. A true mint-made error occurs during the manufacturing process. A post-mint scratch happens after the coin has entered circulation. Those two things can look surprisingly similar to someone who is not familiar with error coins. That is why professional examination is so important, especially when a coin is being described as extremely valuable. The reverse of the 1965 Washington quarter features the American bald eagle with wings spread beneath the inscriptions United States of America and E pluribus unum. The denomination quarter dollar appears below. The design combines national symbolism with the familiar Washington portrait, creating a coin that represents both American history and the transition into modern clad coinage. Because 1965 was the first year of the regular copper-nickel-clad Washington quarter, the coin has an important place in collecting. Many examples were saved by people who recognized the change from silver to clad metal, but the enormous production quantity means that ordinary circulated examples remain common. Collectors therefore focus on quality, varieties, errors, and unusual characteristics when looking for something special. Condition is another important factor. The example we're discussing is described as being in fine condition, with a worn date and unusual surface characteristics. Fine condition means the coin has experienced considerable circulation, with some major design details still visible but significant wear across the portrait and lettering. For a common 1965 quarter, that condition alone would not create a huge premium. The same applies to a dark or dirty surface. Old coins can become discolored through exposure to moisture, chemicals, soil, or storage conditions. A dark appearance does not automatically indicate rarity. In many cases, cleaning or environmental damage actually reduces collector appeal. This is why collectors should never polish a coin simply because it looks dirty. For this particular coin, the most interesting possibility would be if the small line near Washington's portrait were professionally identified as a genuine mint-made die feature, or another recognized error. If the date appearance were also proven to result from a specific minting characteristic rather than post-mint damage, the coin could become considerably more interesting to specialists. However, a realistic market value must be based on evidence. A normal circulated 1965 Washington quarter is not a six-figure or million-dollar coin. Even high-grade examples have generally traded at far more modest prices, although exceptional varieties and top-condition pieces can bring stronger premiums. PCGS records an auction result of $12,650 for a particularly exceptional 1965 Washington quarter, demonstrating that condition can matter greatly while still remaining far below $700,000. For a hypothetical scenario in which this particular coin were authenticated as an extremely unusual and previously undocumented mint error with major collector demand, a dramatic headline valuation could be discussed as high as $700,000. But that would require extraordinary evidence, independent authentication, and a competitive auction. It should never be presented as the normal value of a 1965 quarter with an erased date or a small cut line. That distinction is important for anyone searching through old coins. The market does not pay huge prices simply because a coin is old, dirty, damaged, or unusual looking. Collectors pay premiums